Good evening, and welcome to the Election 2008 Forum. My name is Jim McCormick from the Department of Political Science. This forum is an initiative of the department and the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I particularly want to thank the college for its support. We also received additional support for this forum from the Committee on Lectures. Our format for this evening is to ask each of our distinguished speakers to comment on the 2008 election for about 20 minutes each, and then we'll open it up for discussion and comment by the audience with the panel here. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. James Campbell. Dr. Campbell is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Buffalo, or more correctly, the University at Buffalo, SUNY. He holds a PhD in political science from Syracuse University. He is a former American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow and a former program director at the National Science Foundation. He is currently president-elect of Pi Sigma Alpha, the National Political Science Honorary. His research focuses on congressional and presidential elections, and he has written several books and numerous articles on both of these kinds of elections. His latest book, the second edition of The American Campaign, is available here this evening, and you're welcome to peruse it at the end of the evening tonight. Dr. Campbell is particularly known for his electoral forecasting models that he has done over several election cycles. My understanding is that his 2004 electoral predictions proved to be the closest in estimating the actual results compared to a number of other political scientists who engage in this kind of electoral forecasting. Perhaps he will share with us tonight the 2008 results. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Campbell.
Well, thank you, Jim, and I'd like to express my appreciation for being invited here this evening and for all those who have sponsored this event. It certainly won't take the three Jims here to make this an interesting election. This is probably one of the most interesting elections, and we still have close to a month to go, and it just gets wilder and wilder each week. What I'd like to do this evening is present my talk is really in three segments. First is concerns an outlook on the election from well before the election began, and why we probably should have expected from the beginning that this would be a close election. And there are a number of sort of fundamental factors that are in place that I think would lead you to that conclusion, which differs in many respects from what some of my political science colleagues believe would have been a sizable Obama victory from the beginning. Secondly, I'd like to talk about my forecasting model, which, as Jim mentioned, I created before the 1992 election, and it's been applied in elections since, and with a good degree of success. And I'll tell you what the forecasting model predicts for this year. But I'll tell you in advance that I don't believe it. I think this is an unusual election, one in which the events of the last month have really superseded any factors that could have been considered by anyone forecasting this election. So let me begin with discussing some of the fundamentals that set the context for the 2008 election. And they're really divided into two groups. First, the nature of or the disposition of the audience toward the candidates and parties. Partisanship, ideological polarization, both are key ingredients to determining whether how predisposed the public was, the electorate was, toward both parties. The second set of factors or fundamental forces are the division within the parties over the nomination battles, whether the fact that this was an election involving an open seat presidential contest, which I think is often neglected in reviewing sort of the basics that are in place before the election. And then the fifth and sixth points concern the what political scientists would call retrospective voting and prospective voting, the record of the in-party on the president's performance or the administration's performance in office and how that applies to the in-party's candidate, John McCain, and also the candidates' records on value issues, sort of prospective voting, looking toward the future. Well, in terms of partisanship, what we know, at least from the 2004 election, is that the parties are pretty evenly divided. Democrats outnumber Republicans if you look at the entire public, but it's a much smaller advantage for the Democrats than it used to be, and the parties are really near parity when it comes to looking at actual voters. So this would indicate that this is going to be or set up to be a fairly close election. If you see here, looking at all respondents for 2004, Democrats had about a 9-point advantage among all respondents in the National Election Study. When you whittle it down just to registered voters, it was a 5-point advantage. Reported voters is a 1.3% percentage point advantage, and only a little over 1 point when you looked at actual voters, people who actually voted in the election. So the parties are pretty close to evenly balanced, and that's something that should have led us to expect right from the beginning that this would be a very close election. Second long-term predisposition that's important is ideology, and we know over time that the American public has become more polarized. The center in American politics has been shrinking. There are fewer people who are moderates or non-ideological than used to be the case. People have sort of chosen up sides since the 1990s. There are a lot more conservatives and some more liberals, and fewer moderates. And what makes this more important is that ideology is more strongly correlated with partisanship. So that means that the partisans, Democrats and Republicans, are less likely than ever to defect and vote for the opposite party's candidate. And this is a chart from a figure from 1972 to 2004, plotting the number of self-described moderates and those people who said they don't know what their ideological predispositions were. And you can see, the top line is moderates, the red line here are conservatives, and the blue line at the bottom are liberals. And you can see that back in the 70s and early 80s, moderates and non-ideologicals were about half, or a little bit more than half in some cases, of all voters, reported voters. They're a larger share if you include everybody. But once you look at those people who are just voting, moderates are about half of the public. And conservatives were a little over 30%, liberals were down around 20%. Skip ahead to the 1996, 2000, 2004 era. You can see that the number of conservatives has rose during this period, basically rivals the number of moderates. The number of moderates has declined, and the number of liberals, at least it looks like in the last few elections, the number of liberals has also increased a little bit. The key point is that the public is more polarized, and there are fewer people in the center. That should be, again, particularly because it correlates so highly with partisanship, that should produce a closer election. Third component, to go through this pretty quickly because I want to get to the punchline here, and that's what's going to happen this year. Early party unity is very important, and this year it seems as though both parties have had a problem with getting their party bases together early on. But it's been a very different problem for the Democrats than it was for the Republicans. Democrats had a split, it was a difference over supporting Obama versus Clinton. Ideologically, they were very similar, so there weren't deep-seated philosophical differences here. But there were personality differences, and the campaign left the party somewhat more divided than it might have been otherwise. On the Republican side, it was a very different problem inside the party. That McCain had a substantial problem with conservatives, with the conservative base of the Republican Party. They just didn't trust him. They thought he was too moderate. He not dependable as a conservative voice. Trying to gauge, whoop, oh, hit the wrong button here. Whoop. Up. Okay, here we are. Trying to gauge the level of party loyalty. I took the average Gallup poll loyalty ratings in August. 79% of Democrats indicated at that point that they were going to vote for Obama. 85% of Republicans indicated they were going to vote for McCain. Both of those numbers are somewhat lower than we've seen in previous elections. It suggests that perhaps that this was a little bit more of a problem for Democrats than it was for Republicans, but in both cases, it suggested that the election would be close. Both parties had a problem. It was not as though one party had a very eager, unified base, and the other was contentious. Fourth component is incumbency. Open seat elections are historically closer elections than seats elections with incumbents running. And 2008 is more open than usual in that we have no vice president. The Republican candidate was openly at odds with the administration over a number of policies. There was no love lost there, and I think that again makes this more likely to be a closely fought election. This is the history of this, going back to the Civil War, 1868, the end of the Civil War, to 2004. In open seat elections, there have been 13 open seat elections, that is, a presidential election without an incumbent running, since 1868. 6 of them were decided with the winner getting less than 51.5% of the vote. So almost half of these elections were nail-biting elections. In contrast, when an incumbent's running, it's very unusual to get an election that's that close. And you can see at the other end of the scale, landslides are almost unheard of when you have an open seat election, and it's fairly frequent when an incumbent's in the race. So again, on a historical grounds, you might suppose that 2008 would be another case where the election will be closely decided. Now, so you have 4 factors that suggest a close election. One factor clearly favors the Democrats in this election. That's retrospective evaluations. Voters' evaluations of the performance of the in-party counts in elections. Voters reward or punish the in-party candidate based on the past performance of the administration. And evaluations of the Bush administration are extremely low. So this is clearly an Obama advantage. If you look at, the history of this from 1948 to 2004, you can see that there's a fairly strong relationship. This is the approval rating for the president in July of the election year, and then the vote for the incumbent, for the in-party candidate in November. And you can see it's a fairly strong relationship. In 2004, Bush had about 48% of approval, and just came up close to the trend line here. Well, we have this year in July, we had the president with just over 30% approval rating, and that's only his father and Jimmy Carter had approval ratings that low that late in the election cycle. And so that is bad news for the Republicans, good news for Senator Obama. That has to be held with a caveat, though, and that is there are 2 reasons to think that this is a problem for McCain, but it's not an insurmountable problem. That retrospective evaluations don't matter as much when the incumbent's not running. That is, if President Bush was the Republican candidate this year, it would have been a laugher 3 months ago. It would have been done. The fact that Bush is not the Republican candidate makes this a very different situation. Secondly, most of the drop in President Bush's ratings have occurred among Republicans and independents, mostly among Republicans. And these are not necessarily very likely voters for Obama. First is the difference in the effect of retrospective evaluations in an open seat race when the incumbent's not running versus when the incumbent is running. What we see here is once you control for party identification, the differences between the vote for the in-party candidate, between those who approve and disapprove, is lower in each case when it's an open seat. What that means, the bottom line interpretation of this is that approval ratings don't matter as much when the incumbent's not on the ticket. They matter, and you can see that it still makes a difference. The in-party candidate, the successor candidate, if you will, always does better among those who are approving of his predecessor, but the difference is smaller. And so that's essentially that. What we're seeing here is that the retrospective evaluations are muted when it comes to an open seat election. And the second point that sort of mitigates the retrospective problem for McCain is that most of Bush's drop in approval from 2004 to today has been among Republicans. If you look here, this is overall approval rating in 2004 before the election, before the 2004 election, and then the latest Gallup approval rating. You see Bush dropped from 48% down to 27%. 27% it's getting in the Jimmy Carter territory at this point. It's very low, a 21-point drop. Now, where did that drop come from? It didn't come from Democrats. He was at 11% in 2004. When Bush won the White House, won the election in 2004, he was getting only 11% approval from Democrats. It's now down to 3%. Pretty much, I guess, Joe Lieberman, who else? Zell Miller, maybe some confused Floridians, but it's down. It's down within the margin of error. This could be zero. I mean, so it's an 8-point, but it's only an 8-point drop. It's not a huge drop. Where the drop is really sizable is among Republicans. He stood at 93% in 2004, and is now down to only 64%. Almost a 30-point drop among Republicans. Now, the drop has also been among independents, but independents are a much smaller group. So the big loss here is among Republicans. And the importance of this is that these people are people who aren't very happy. This 29% who are now disapproving of Bush, who didn't disapprove of him 4 years ago, are angry at Bush, but that doesn't mean that they're fertile territory for Obama to pick up. They are, in fact, Republicans, and that may still guide their choice. Final factor that suggests this might be a close election is the candidates' records on values issues. Moving beyond the speeches and the records in the Senate, we can actually evaluate how the candidates have performed in the past. This is an unusual election because we have two senators running, two senators that served in the Senate at the same time. And if we look at their records on moderation versus ideology and on bipartisanship, it suggests that McCain may have an advantage on that. There are a number of groups that rate senators and members of the House on their voting records. Two of the most prominent over the years has been the ADA, who's a liberal group rating senators on their records, how liberal they are, and then the ACU has done the same for conservatives. Well, I flipped one of them and combined them to create an index from 0% liberal to 100% liberal for roll calls in 2006 and 2007. And actually, I have up here, we may want to distribute this at this point. or I'll make it available for you if you'd like to take a look at it. I've put together a quiz based on the issues that are actually used in these ADA and ACU ratings. So you could actually see what instead of just talking in general terms about liberalism and conservatism, when rubber meets the road, what were they voting on and how did they differ? So I put together a set of, I think, 16 questions for the Encyclopedia Britannica's blog site that looked at this. But what's important here is that McCain is almost perfectly positioned between being a moderate and a conservative. A perfect conservative would be 0. Perfectly moderate would split his votes 50-50 between liberals and conservatives. McCain's at 24. Obama is almost as far to the left as it was possible to be. He's 95% liberal. Now, if elections are decided in the middle, even though the middle's shrinking, that should be a distinct advantage for Senator McCain. And it's probably one of the reasons why he was not simply blown out of the water at this point by the retrospective evaluations, why he went into the conventions pretty much tied with Senator Obama. On bipartisanship, we have Congressional Quarterly rates how often you vote with your party. Sort of the opposite of that would be how often you were acting in bipartisan terms, and McCain does much better than that. Obama, most of the time, voted with his party. McCain oftentimes did not. And so, again, if voters are looking for this bipartisan, pulling together kind of leader, that should be an advantage for Senator McCain. So, totaling up these 6 components, what we see is 4 of them lead to a close election. 1 should predispose this to an Obama victory, 1 to a McCain victory. I think that's the reason why we might have expected early on this to be a very close election. So this brings me to the forecast. My forecasting model is a fairly simple model. It really amounts to a sophisticated reading of the polls, taking into account their historical relationship between the polls and the vote. So what I did was I looked at the Gallup poll at different points in the campaign in elections going back to 1948, starting in June, July, August, before the conventions, after the conventions, and so forth, and looked at how the polls were related to the votes at those times, and also took into account the economy, the contemporary context of the election. The track record has been pretty good. The mean out-of-sample error has been 1.6. In actual practice, it's been a little bit over between 2 and 2.5% of the vote. That's better than the National Election Study, by the way, that measures the vote after the election. So 2 months in advance of the election, the errors in my forecasting model are smaller than the National Election Study's errors, and it's just a little bit higher than the last Gallup poll done. So 2 months out versus the last Gallup poll, the model does just about as well as the last Gallup poll. And the reason for this is you can get a sense of this in a general way by just looking at when candidates who were ahead in the polls went on to win the election, or when the candidate who was ahead in the polls actually lost the election. You can see in June, the front-running candidate, the candidate who was ahead in the poll, out of the last 15 elections going back to 1948, the June poll leader won 8 times and lost 7 times. About the same as a flip of the coin. June polls mean nothing. Gets a little bit better in late July. By the time the conventions are over, they're actually fairly accurate, or they have a pretty good record anyway. Out of the 15 elections, the poll leader after the convention won 12 times and lost 3 times. The 3 losses were Tom Dewey in 1948, Richard Nixon, who just barely had a lead in 1960, and Jimmy Carter, who had just had a small lead after 1980 conventions. The early September polls, and usually historically there's been some gap between the conventions and the early September reading. It's 13 wins and 2 losses. Late September, 14 wins and 1 loss. So you can see that by September, early September, we can really get a pretty good read on, and we don't do much better even in October and November than we do in early September. This is a little bit fine-tuning that analysis. This looks at the average error, average absolute error between the polls, again, over these 15 elections going back to 1948, at the different times in the election year, from June to November, and the vote. So we're looking at how, if you accepted the polls as a literal forecast, how off would they have been on average? And you can see, again, June polls do terrible, 7 points off, plus or minus 7. That's a pretty wide gap. As you get closer to the election, it gets a little better. But even the polls right in early November, the first week in November, they're still not very good. The regression only. So I take the regression models, look at the historical relationship between the polls and the vote. Essentially, it discounts the lead. It indicates how much you should discount the lead of the poll leader at different times in the campaign. And you can see that the average error has dropped quite a bit over that time and improves in each instance over just accepting the polls as a literal forecast. Now, if you add the economy in, the second quarter growth rate in the economy, you can see that it, again, improves at each point and basically bottoms out in early September. And that's the basis of my the forecasting model. I've also added a second model because in response to the parties pushing up their conventions later on in the season, because that could contaminate the early September polls by the convention bump. So I have really 2 models. One looking at the early September preference poll and the economy. You can see that the statistical, I won't get into too much of the statistics here, but it's about 90% of the variance explained by those 2 indicators. The mean out-of-sample error is a 1.6 percentage point. So it looks like a fairly strong model. The convention bump model uses the pre-convention poll, the net convention bump. And what's important here is there's a greater discounting. Less of the net convention bump survives to the election than just the poll itself. And so, again, that's sort of a kind of a safety net model because of the conventions. If you plug in the values for this year, it suggests McCain should get 52.7% of the vote in the basic model. And if you look at the convention bump model, again, this is just going through the math of the formula. The convention bump model suggests that or indicates that he should get 52.2%. Now, I should note that this is out of sync with all of the other political science forecasting models. All of the other models, this is coming out in the current issue of the October issue of PS from the American Political Science Association, all of the other models predict that Obama will get a majority of the vote. The reason is, I think, if you look at what goes into these models, all of the other models are retrospective models, approval rating and consumer satisfaction. And of course, as I indicated, on purely retrospective grounds, this should be a very strong Democratic year. There's no question about it. Bush's approval ratings are appallingly low. But I don't think voters are purely retrospective. I think if you look at the individual evidence, that's also the case. I mean, these other models basically assume that the candidates don't matter, that nominating Mitt Romney or George Bush again, or a clone of George Bush, would have left the Republicans in the same position as nominating John McCain, and I think that's silly. So I think first, open seat elections are in fact different. They're less retrospective. Candidates matter. Even the vice presidential candidates matter. So what happens in the conventions matters, and my forecasting model comes a little bit after the others, takes into account what happens at the conventions when a lot of people do make up their minds about which way they're turning. So, how do the polls mesh with this forecast? This is the Gallup poll, the Gallup tracking poll of registered voters from the end of July up through the convention. You can see that in July and August, Obama had a lead. It varied quite a bit, but it was around 48.5%, 49% of the two-party vote. Just before the convention, it sort of closed up a little bit. Before the Democratic convention, it was pretty close to 50-50. Democrats hold their convention, they get a pretty sizable bump from their convention. It pushes the vote to about, for McCain, pushes it down from a little bit over 50 to about 46, a little bit over a 3-point bump, 3.5-point bump. Then the Republicans hold their convention, they get even a bigger bump out of this. And this is the basis for the forecast suggesting that this would be an Obama, or rather a McCain victory. Campaign looked at this point to be on track for a narrow McCain victory. And again, remember, poll leaders after the conventions, 13 out of 15 won their elections. So it looked like that was where we were headed. Then the Wall Street meltdown. I think this is sort of like a meteor hitting the models. I think this is so completely unprecedented. I think it'd be interesting to go back in history to see if there's anything like this that happened after Labor Day that was completely unanticipated. I won't go through all the details here, but September 7th, we had Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac being bailed out, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, AIG. The president requests a rescue bill. Washington Mutual is seized and sold. The Dow Jones dropped 778 points. And today it dropped, another 600 points. So, I mean, we're looking at a September surprise, essentially. So what happened? We were positioned for a McCain, looked like a McCain narrow victory, perhaps, or at least that's the odds were with him, and it's gone steadily downward. None of the models anticipated this or could have foreseen this financial crisis. It all occurred. If you actually go back to the conventions, this didn't even play much of a role in the convention. None of the models could have or could have foreseen the timing of this crisis, and this is also very important. If this crisis had been a month or two later or a month or two earlier, its political implications would have been far different. It's certainly not evident in any of the polls or sort of concern about this, or to the extent it was kind of tempered. The second quarter growth rate that many of us have found to be the most important economic indicator from a historical standpoint, originally it was 1.9%, then the next reading of it was 3.3. Essentially, it was close to average for the second quarter. The mean growth rate is 3.4% in an election year. So in elections since 1948, 8 have been better and 7 worse. So this didn't look anything like it was a game changer at all. So this seems to be that rare event whose timing and magnitude and partisan implications make it really an unanticipated game changer. It has changed the course of the campaign, and I think clearly in Senator Obama's favor, and probably will change the results in his favor as well. Finally, one admittedly partisan but factual note. I think there's a terrific irony in this, maybe a sad irony. That is, the candidate who tried to tighten the regulation of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac may lose the election because of their excesses. Now, you can say that this wasn't completely about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but I think at base, they were the enablers here. And while the candidate who employed as high-level advisors two of the biggest abusers of this system, Franklin Raines and Jim Johnson, as advisors, they helped to create the mess that now Senator Obama is benefiting from. So that's the end with 26 days to go.
Thank you very much, Jim. That, I'm sure, will stimulate lots of questions and comments. We'll turn to that in a few moments, but first we want to turn to our second speaker, who has a little bit different set of views to take here with regard to some of the issues in the election, particularly regarding foreign policy issues. Our second speaker this evening is Dr. Jim Lindsay. He received his PhD from Yale University, and he currently holds the Tom Slick Chair in International Affairs and is director of the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas at Austin. Is that right?
Correct.
Prior to his joining the University of Texas in 2006, Dr. Lindsay held several other prestigious positions. He was vice president and the Morris R. Greenberg Chair at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York City. He was deputy director and senior fellow in foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution. And in 1996 and 1997, he served on the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. Finally, and importantly, Dr. Lindsay was a professor of political science at the University of Iowa from 1987 to 1999. Dr. Lindsay is a leading authority on American foreign policy making process and the impact of domestic politics on foreign policy. He has written widely on the topic, both for the academic community and for the public at large. His book, America Unbound, The Bush Revolution in Foreign Policy, is widely acclaimed as one of the best analyses and critiques of the current administration's foreign policy. In addition, he has written several books on the role of Congress in foreign policy and on crucial security issues such as national missile defense. Tonight, Dr. Lindsay has agreed to identify and discuss some of the crucial issues in the foreign policy arena for the next administration. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Lindsay.
I must say the nicest thing about giving talks is you get to listen to other people brag on you. So thank you very much, Jim. I appreciate it. I want to compliment Jim Campbell on an excellent presentation. I also want to thank you all for coming here tonight. And if I may, I really want to do a shout-out for Jim McCormick, as he is a terrific member of the political science profession. He has been a major contributor, and it's been a pleasure to have him as a friend over these last couple of decades. So can I just get everybody to give some applause for Jim for arranging this? As you might imagine from Jim's introduction, it's a great pleasure for me to be here in Ames, Iowa. Iowa holds a special place in my heart. Not one, not two, not three, but all four of my kids were born in the great state of Iowa. And I never really appreciated how great the state of Iowa was until I went to Texas. When I lived in Iowa, I'm a gardener. It's my great passion. Well, Iowa has the best soil in the world. Okay, you can go out and you can work with your hands and you can feel good about yourself. Texas is a wonderful state, don't get me wrong. But what I've never, until I moved to Texas, had to deal with poisonous critters when you go out and garden and you put your hand down in the soil and a scorpion stings you. I will tell you from personal experience, it is painful. So don't mess with scorpions. Unfortunately, no one up here has to deal with them. Listen, I would love to be upbeat and talking about foreign policy under the next administration, that whoever wins, whether it's the valiant Senator John McCain or the impressive Senator Barack Obama, that they're going to come into the White House and fix what ails us. But I can't come and tell you that tonight. I think whoever becomes president is going to face a whole host of foreign policy problems that we have not yet figured out how to solve. And I guess if I had to give a headline, that's what it would be. But I promised Jim that in the course of my conversation I'd cover a whole bunch of different bases, one of which is to begin with the question of what role is foreign policy going to play in this campaign. Now, if we went back a year ago, people in my profession were all excited because this was going to be a foreign policy election. Foreign policy analysts are always looking for that election that's going to turn on foreign policy. We really want to have one. And this looked to be the year. Certainly, foreign policy was critical in the presidential primaries. I would argue that both Senator McCain and Senator Obama owed their nominations to foreign policy, and particularly to the issue of Iraq. For Senator Obama, what allowed him to sort of catch fire, particularly in this state, early on was his unequivocal opposition to the war in Iraq, unlike Senator Clinton or Senator Biden on the list who had voted for the war. Senator Obama could point to a speech he had given early on raising questions about the war. Conversely, for someone like Senator McCain, had the virtue of being in a Republican Party that was very concerned about where Iraq was going. He was full-throated in his pursuit of the surge and pursuing victory, and I think that really helped his run for the nomination because, as Jim pointed out, he was not trusted in a lot of parts of the Republican Party. And I can tell you, as somebody who spends a lot of time dealing with Republicans in the great state of Texas, home of George W. Bush, they have a particular lack of enthusiasm for Senator McCain. But if you go back a year ago, the appeals of talking about Iraq and what each candidate was going to do in Iraq would resonate with Americans because if you looked at Gallup and went to its most important problem question, a standard question Gallup asked, what the most important problem is facing the country, back in early fall of 2007, about 1 in 3 Americans said the issue they were most concerned about was Iraq. No other issue came close to it. Only one other issue, immigration, was even in double digits. So Iraq was the big issue. Now let's fast forward to late August, Gallup's most recent poll, and what you discover is ask Americans what's the most important problem facing the country, and 6 out of 10 Americans say the economy. Foreign policy has pretty much disappeared from the radar screen. No doubt, I think, as Jim talked about with his reference to the asteroid hitting the campaigns, if Gallup is to go out this week and say what's the number one issue facing the country, it's going to be something to do with the economy. Now, that's really sort of changed the tenor of the campaign, a lot less talk about foreign policy. It's understandable, but in many ways it is disappointing. It's disappointing because the next president's foreign policy inbox is going to be overflowing with problems. There are tough choices to be made, and one of the things we're not going to really have in this campaign is a real discussion about how to handle those issues. And as a result, I don't think for whoever becomes president that the public is really prepared for the kind of choices the president will have to make. So the 2008 election is not going to be a foreign policy election again. People in my business are going to have to shoot for 2012 to finally get that campaign that hinges on foreign policy. And some of you may be saying to yourself, well, so what? Obama and McCain really aren't that different when it comes to foreign policy. Both of them favor an activist, interventionist foreign policy. They're both in many ways keeping with sort of post-World War II American foreign policy practice. Neither Obama nor Senator McCain is challenging the way foreign policy has been done for the last half century or so. Certainly they're not challenging it in the way that Representative Ron Paul challenged in his rather sort of quirky campaign, which really called for a non-interventionist foreign policy where America would go back and heed the injunction of John Quincy Adams from 1821 not to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. So while it's true that both Senator McCain and Senator Obama are both internationalists and pursue or favor an activist foreign policy, that's true. But the differences between them are real, and they have very real consequences, and they lead to very different policy choices. Senator McCain sees violent, radical extremism as an existential threat to the United States. He has been unequivocal. This is threat number one. No other threat comes closer. Senator Obama argues the challenge that comes from Islamic radicals is one of many threats that we face. He would add in climate change, nuclear proliferation, infectious diseases. On Iraq, Senator McCain has been full-throated in his desire to stay and find victory in Iraq. Senator Obama has called for withdrawing all combat troops, let me emphasize their combat troops, within 16 months. On issues of trade, which obviously affect people in the state of Iowa. Senator McCain is an ardent free trader. He wants more of it. If you read his essay he wrote for Foreign Affairs, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, I don't think there is a foreign policy problem that Senator McCain doesn't think more free trade can't help. Senator Obama, on the other hand, is much more skeptical, like many Democrats, about the wisdom of freer trade. On a League of Democracies, Senator McCain wants to create a League of Democracies that would bring together all democratic countries to work in concert. So far, Senator Obama has been silent on the issue. There are also important differences on how to conduct negotiations or diplomacy, as we have in fact seen in several of the debates. Senator McCain has been critical of Senator Obama for his desire or his willingness to meet with heads of states that we have bad relations with without preconditions. Senator McCain has made it clear he won't talk to those people. In fact, he may not even talk to some of our allies, like the Prime Minister of Spain. So there are important differences between the two. Let's look to the future. One of these two gentlemen, I assume, is going to win. I think that's the way the rules work. I think Jim is right that Senator Obama is more likely to win. But then again, if you can get an late September, early October surprise, perhaps you can get a late October, early November surprise. Who knows? But regardless who wins in November, they're going to face the same challenges. And let me lay them out quite briefly, because I think they are quite difficult to face. Really three broad categories of challenges. One is a very full inbox. They always say, be careful what you wish for, you might get it. And I think that whoever goes and sits in the Oval Office on the afternoon of November 20th, 2009 is going to say, whoa, there's a lot of stuff to do. Let me just run off a list of the issues you're going to have to deal with. Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, North Korea, restarting the Middle East peace process. What do you do about Hezbollah? What do you do about Hamas? What do you do about trade? What do you do about climate change? What do you do about energy dependence? What do you do about a weak dollar? What do you do about the rise of China? What do you do about a resurgent Russia? What do you do about Georgia? What do you do about international financial regulation? That's just sort of the first page. And we go on to lots of other issues after that. Now, here's what I want to tell you. Both of the candidates will get up and talk about how they have policies to deal with these problems. Yes, they do. They have policies. It's not clear, though, that they have solutions. And there's a difference between the two. And indeed, one of the great secrets in Washington that you're not allowed to confess is that actually some of those problems out there are not solvable, or not easily solvable, or we're not even sure how to solve them. Classic one we were talking about before has to do with the issue of Pakistan. Everybody, quote, wants to fix Pakistan. It would be great if we could fix Pakistan. I don't know if anybody really knows how to make that happen, because in large part, getting Pakistan fixed is going to depend a lot upon the Pakistanis, and they themselves disagree about the direction of their society. Okay? So one challenge is a very full inbox. And remember, presidents don't get elected just to worry about foreign policy. They have a whole domestic side of the house they have to worry about. Second challenge is a depleted toolbox. Number one, no surprise, the United States has a lot less goodwill around the world than it did 8 years ago. Undeniable. I spend a lot of time going abroad, and I hear it all the time. And you hear it from close allies. You hear it from in countries that are not allied with the United States. People are angry at America, don't trust American motives, aren't willing to follow the American lead. And what they would say to us is that when you lead badly, and they would argue the Bush administration has, few are going to follow. We don't want to follow. Second aspect of a depleted toolbox is we have a stretched military. When you talk to senior military officials, particularly in the Army and the Marine Corps, what they'll tell you is our op tempo, our operational tempo is too high. We need help. We have, among other things, people are too busy, too many rotations, they're too long. It is creating great strains in the military. Third part of the depleted toolbox is we have a depleted public treasury. We were on schedule this year for a budget deficit of $550 billion. That's $500 billion. What was it? Everett Dirksen of the great state of Illinois once said, a million here, a million there, and you start talking about real money. $550 billion is real money. And that's before, those projections are before any of the, what do we call them, rescue packages, bailouts to the financial sector. We're going to be very, very strained at a time when the baby boomer generation is beginning to retire, putting much more pressure on a variety of programs, including Social Security, and at the same time, there seems to be some agreement that there's a lot more we need to do on the domestic side of the house. Fourth part of a depleted toolbox is we have a weary and a leery public. If you look at the polls, it's pretty clear the public is skeptical about what government can do. They feel they have contributed enough. Not really sure they want to be called on to contribute more. So I say we face a full inbox, we have a depleted toolbox. But the third aspect that makes it really challenging for the next president is we face a very different global context. The era of unquestioned American preeminence has come to an end. And it's not clear that American decision makers or the American public have come to grips with that. And indeed, if you just think about it, a few years can make quite a difference. If we were to go back 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, to President Bush landing on the flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln with the banner mission accomplished behind it, there was a lot of talk in the foreign policy world about the unipolar moment, that America was the Prometheus laying down the law to the pygmies. The Iraq War, in fact, was begun in many ways to demonstrate American power. Think of all the talk about shock and awe. But what the Iraq War did in a perverse fashion is not demonstrate American power, but rather the limits to American power. Among other things, it has emboldened our adversaries. Indeed, one of the reasons why it's difficult to deal with the Iranians right now is because the Iranians, or think of the Russians, believe that the trend is on their side. And as they say on Wall Street, the trend is your friend. Except I'm not sure they're saying it today. The trend's going in the wrong direction. But the United States no longer is so obviously the winner. The exertion, or its ability to exert its influence on others has declined. And we can see it in two tangible ways. One, look at the most recent round of trade negotiations, the so-called Doha round. The way trade negotiations typically go is they fuss and they run around saying it's going to collapse, it's going to collapse. In the last moment, Washington sits down with the Europeans and forces a deal. Everyone thought this was going to happen this time around, but the United States, even though it had the EU, the European Union's help, couldn't get India and China to play ball. The Doha round collapsed. And if you look at the current crisis, how it's playing abroad, what we keep hearing again and again is that America is, in essence, through its unfettered use of financial tools, is peddling a very, very bad product, and people are running away from the United States as fast as they can. Indeed, in many ways, the American model to economic development has taken a very, very heavy blow, whereas the Chinese and the Russians, and this is one of the great ironies, having Russia step in to bail out Iceland. Russia bailing out a NATO ally. So I think the real danger is whoever becomes president in January of 2009 is going to founder because there's simply too many problems of too great an importance, which we have neither clear strategies for success, nor do we have a consensus on what to do. And here we come back to domestic issues and domestic politics. It's not just that domestic challenges the next president are significant, and they are. Whether we're talking about getting our fiscal house in order, dealing with education, worrying about the challenges in the healthcare system, it's that we're also likely to get a heavily Democratic Congress. And that is going to pose challenges for whomever wins in November. If you are John McCain, you are going to face a Congress controlled by the Democrats, which is spitting angry that you somehow managed to eke out a victory. Okay, and if you want to know what that kind of climate looks like, think of Bill Clinton in 1995, 1996. In politics and much of the rest of life, turnabout is fair play. And it's hard to imagine that Democrats are going to be nicer to a President McCain than Republicans were to a President Clinton. But even if it's Senator Obama who wins in November, he faces a different problem. He is going to have Democrats who expect him, or Democrats on the Hill, who expect him to carry out their agenda, not thinking that their role is to follow his lead. And indeed, I would imagine President Obama is going to face intense pressure from Democrats, given sort of what Democratic concerns are, and reflecting the constituencies in the Democratic Party, to focus on domestic issues and have very, very little interest, or far lesser interest, in worrying about foreign policy issues. There's going to be heavy pressure from Democrats to get out of Iraq and get out of it quickly. Going to be heavy pressure from Democrats to walk away from certain trade deals, and particularly to reopen the question of NAFTA. And I think President Obama is going to find it very, very difficult to ride herd over his fellow Democrats. In this case, he'd be like Bill Clinton back in 93, 94, where he thought that his fellow Democrats on Capitol Hill will help him. In many ways, they made his life much more difficult. I will stop here. I hope I have not spoken too long or said too little. And I guess Jim and I will now field questions.
Yes. Thank you very much. We do have a microphone here. We really want to open it up for your comments to the panelists, or comments on anything that has been said tonight. So please pop right up to the microphone here. First question is always the toughest.
I'm trying to make a tradition of being the first person to the mic many a time. Let me make a couple of comments, if you don't mind. First of all, to Professor Lindsay, thank you for such an upbeat, positive outlook.
Mr. Sunshine.
I do hope that you will continue to advise presidents. Please don't volunteer to help them write any speeches, or it'll be called Malaise 2, won't it? I would like to share with you a piece of information that I got when I talked with Tom Harkin about Senator McCain. This was sort of a one-on-one, and I was just like, what is John McCain like? He says, you won't believe this. I just can't get over it. He still wants to go back and bomb Vietnam until we win. This bomb Iran, that's really his foreign policy attitude. So I'm not sure how widespread that is, but that's from an insider. Now, if I could go to Jim number 2, I guess, since Jim 1 was McCormick. One 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 was McCormick. Would like to ask you to put some of the slides back up real quick, if I could.
Okay. Well,
And we'll start with figure 2.
I guess somebody has to trigger this somehow.
They were very nice, and I really enjoy the visual. I think I'm a visual learner.
You like all those fades and stuff?
And figure 2 is the graph, if I remember right, the diagonal line going off up to from our point of view, from lower left to lower right. If that's the one I'm talking about.
Is the approval rating? Was that the?
It's the correlation between the votes on one side and votes on the other, I thought.
Well, let's see.
Let's just wait till we get back there. They never clean the air filter in this school. I swear to God, you go into a classroom and you turn on the machine, and every darn time it says, please clean the air filter. It's been going on for every year I've been doing this.
Will that go off, you think, or-
Yeah, well, after
Yeah, it goes off.
Let's see. Figure 2.
That one.
All right.
Okay. Now, I know that you know this, but I want to suggest to you, on the vertical axis is percentage points, isn't it?
Right. Well, they're both percent.
Right. But the scales are different.
Right. Exactly.
And the scale on the bottom needs to be spread out tremendously to the right. And what will that do to your line?
Well, it would make it
Flatter.
flatter, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is why I put the 50-50 here. But yeah, it would make it flatter.
It would.
Absolutely.
And of course, if this were to go to a panel to review for publication, I think they're going to suggest that you flatten that out.
Unless they have extremely wide pages. It doesn't change the distances here. So I mean, it's still the correlation between
Right, the
schools.
correlation,
So
which
it's still-
at basically the R-square of 0.92 is the biggest I ever saw in my whole life. It's like,
Well, this is not 0.92.
Well,
but
one
this
of the
is
ones
right,
up there
okay,
was, though.
right, exactly. Yeah.
okay, keep going and see if I can jog my memory as to what my second point was. The next one, the one with where you said there were 3 examples of elections that didn't fit.
Oh, yeah.
48, 80, and 60.
Right here.
Yeah. Okay. 48,
48.
that's Harry Truman.
Right.
Of course, one of the problems here is that it's who was ahead in the poll and who won. And of course, 48 is perhaps the closest election we ever had, except for 60.
Well, actually, it wasn't
And
that close
80.
at the end.
Well,
It was unusual in that a candidate who was well behind ended up ahead at the end.
right.
But yeah,
But it was close. And then 60 is arguably the closest election we ever had.
right.
And I'd like to suggest to you that I'll defend the proposition that, in fact, Nixon won. There was too much cheating in Texas, too much cheating in Texas, too much cheating in Illinois, and maybe
They
some
cheat
other
in
states
Texas.
as well.
I take umbrage at that for the record.
And without those 2 states, the Electoral College would have gone too.
Right.
And then what would have happened if Nixon had won in 60? He wouldn't have been the paranoid freak that he was in 68.
Well, you might have been that earlier, but
Might. But I do
I
believe
say that
that
as a
it
Republican.
was that non-loss. And then, of course, in 80 was another terribly, terribly close election. And you have not, your model may be even better than it looks because you've
Right.
called those as points that show
right.
that were the 3 that it didn't work. And yet, boy, you don't give any credit to yourself for the fact that it was, but it was almost.
Well, let me explain that because this is really sort of a crude look at the relationship between polls and election outcomes. Really, the more refined look is here, where you're actually looking at the differences, and so the closeness would actually come, closeness of the vote and the closeness of the polls would actually come into play with these figures of the differences between the polls and the vote. So you're
Yeah.
right that if you just look at this, at just the simple win-loss record, you're going to get, 1960 is close not only in the vote, but it was very close in the polls. So even though Nixon was the front runner in the polls in 1960, he had the slimmest of lead in those,
Right.
just as Kennedy had the slimmest of lead, perhaps, in the vote.
Now, I do
yeah,
have
it
to
wasn't much of a
suggest
change.
that you're missing one election, and 2000 ought to be up there because
Well-
Gore really won.
Well, 2000, I do have in terms of the winner of the popular vote.
Yeah. Okay.
So that
All right.
takes care of that. Yep.
And then one last thing.
Yeah.
I just find it hard to believe that you're going to really rely on a model that shows that up to a few weeks ago you thought McCain was going to have more, going to win. I'll challenge you. 3 months ago I said it was going to be 9 points for Obama. So we'll have to
Okay.
we'll have to see. Now I'll tell you this. I just use my gut, so we'll just have
Yeah.
to see whether or not.
But I think the key to that is let's see if I can get is this, that if you go into the conventions about tied and come out of the convention with a lead, I don't think anyone other than Tom Dewey lost under with that situation. That is, he had a lead that was not a trivial lead. That McCain was, in terms of the percentage of support in the Gallup polls for about a week, was at close to 53%. And it's simply, other than Dewey, it's unprecedented for somebody at that late stage of the election then to lose.
It's a remarkable thing.
Yeah. And I think what it is nobody else is run with the stock market and collapsing and Congress voting $700 billion here and who knows how much down the road. I mean, that's simply an unprecedented, unforeseeable kind of event.
Questions?
Don't let the figures scare you off here.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Seems to me, however, sir, the gentleman from Texas, that I missed one problem, and that is the evolvement of the polarization of the parties is an incredible problem, I would think, regardless of who gets elected to anything anymore. Am I right in this regard, in your respect? How does anybody cope with this, and what, in effect, do we as citizens do about that, if anything?
Is polarization a problem? I think the answer to that is yes. One of the great potential virtues of an election campaign is that it provides an opportunity to have a national discussion about issues. Not because the election will generate unanimity, they seldom do, but rather that the back and forth between candidates, A, prepares the public to understand what the issues are, what the challenges are, prepares people for potential strategies for dealing with those challenges, and while not producing unanimity, can give you at least some level of majority support, so that when you're president and called on to do things, the public in some sense is already there. One of the problems when issues get pushed off the agenda, and I think that's really happened to foreign policy over the last couple of months, is that a lot of these issues are not being discussed. The public's not prepared for really tough choices. Jim talked about the financial crisis being the meteor that's hit the race. And I would argue, even just looking at that, which really has elements of both domestic politics and foreign policy, I would say both of the candidates in the past two debates, actually if you include the vice presidential candidates as well, have bobbed and weaved and ducked over what all of this means. And perhaps to some extent it's because they haven't really had a chance to digest it and evaluate how they really would want to respond, or how much of it they're afraid to be sort of the first one out with their set of policies. But I do think it's a game changer, not just for the election, but again for the country as a whole. And these are very difficult problems. They're going to put enormous fiscal pressure on the United States government, and it's going to require tough choices that, as best I can tell, neither candidate's really preparing the public for. And polarization makes that bad, because if you're dealing with if the electorate is not polarized or not divided, then you don't have a problem, even if you don't talk about it, because there's support or leeway to do what you want to do. But if you have a polarized public, you're going to run into a problem where the moment you try to do something, some group is going to mobilize. That's why I talk at the end. I think if it's Senator McCain, he's going to have a very real problem, because he's going to face a hostile Democratic Congress, which is not going to be inclined to follow his lead. And again, Senator Obama has a slightly different problem, but a problem nonetheless.
You know, one additional point that I think, I draw from that the figures that show that where President Bush lost his approval between 2004 and 2008, is that with polarization, we may be in a situation now where a president, to be modestly successful, has to choose between being a polarized president, that is a very partisan president, or a bipartisan president. You can't do both. You can't sort of serve the base to some extent and then move over and try to put together a broader coalition, because I think you wind up with a coalition of enemies that way. I think that's what happened to President Bush, much like what happened to his father, that he really got into trouble in the end by trying to be bipartisan. I mean, the rap on President W is that he's too partisan. Well, he lost support in the second term because of trying to reach out on issues like immigration, where he really offended his base and hoped to create a broader coalition, but I think he ended up offending everybody, for different reasons. And I think we're in a situation now that you just have to have much more modest expectations and decide early on whether you're going to govern for your base or whether you're going to govern for a bipartisan coalition and kind of write off a big part of your base.
I wonder if I can ask one question here. Both of you mentioned about how this economic meltdown is a sort of a game changer at the presidential election. What does it mean at the congressional election level? How does it play out there? I mean, you both assume that the Democrats are going to assumably make gains in the House and the Senate. But is this late September surprise here going to have any impact there?
I think you'd almost have to go a case-by-case basis. Most of the models and congressional election experts were expecting Democrats to pick up anywhere from 15 to 20 seats in the House and maybe 6 to 8 Senate seats. Could be a little higher now because of the financial meltdown. The problem, what restricts Democrats from picking up more in the House is that they really, in 2006, they kind of skimmed the cream here. They got a lot of the districts that were easy for Democrats to pick off, and now they're getting into the territory that's more clearly Republican territory, and it may be more difficult for them to register gains of more than 20 seats.
The economic meltdown is really bad news for Republican candidates, congressional candidates. I think the trends were that Democrats are going to pick up seats no matter what, in part because the Republicans had more vulnerable seats on the market, plus, at least in the House side, a lot more retirements, so more open seats.
Right.
And American politics, at least outside of the state of Iowa, has developed to a point because of apportionment and redistricting that seats really change hands only when they become open and no incumbent is running. So the trends are always going in that direction. Now you've had the financial meltdown, and we can sit here and talk about how to apportion blame and who had what advisors and who should have known when, and who gave what speech, who sponsored what bill. This is just all background noise to the American public. I think at the end of the day, in this sort of he said, she said, or he said, or she said party discussion, they'll just blame the incumbents, the incumbent party, and I think Republicans are going to take a toll. And what makes it worse for congressional Republicans is they were very scared in late spring, early summer, because they were afraid, oh my God, we're going to get John McCain. He's going to be a weak candidate. He's going to drag us down. And then as McCain started to surge in the polls, particularly after the selection of Governor Palin, there was a little more bounce in their step. Things are looking up for us. He's not going to hurt us. We'll be able to recover. And so you have a double whammy that if the financial crisis hurts Senator McCain for whatever reason and brings him down, from the vantage point of congressional Republicans, it's likely to weigh on them as well, because one of the things you always want to do in a presidential election year is have your party's presidential nominee run strong in your district. It's less desirable to be in a situation where you have to distance yourself from your candidate. You always want that candidate coming in and helping you. And I think right now it's sort of a self-reinforcing cycle here. But then again, never underestimate the powers of incumbency. And again, in some of these states, I mean, sort of strong Republican incumbents are going to win for a whole bunch of reasons. But I think, as Jim pointed out, a lot of the weakest ones have been culled from the herd. There's some more that are going to change hands. And we might get to 60 Democratic seats in the Senate. I still think it's a coin flip. And there's still 27, 26 days?
Yeah,
Something
26.
like that. It seems like an eternity.
One of the things,
But the thing everybody here in Iowa has to look forward to is the day after the election, people will start campaigning for 2012.
That's right.
So what I'm trying to track, I'm looking at Des Moines Register to figure out who the first out-of-state politician is to come in and give a speech here in Iowa after the election.
One of the things to bear in mind, too, about 2006 as sort of a baseline for 2008 is that 2006 was an unusually bad year for Republicans, partly because of the scandals that hit late in the campaign that really cost them a lot. And that was kind of an unusual skimming or culling of the herd in that sense. So I think that makes probably the losses will be a little bit lower as a result this time.
I have a question on the foreign policies and also maybe the election. Just one question about. So first, I will start with the election. My name is James Tudwal. I am a political science senior student here at Iowa State, but I migrated as from Southern Sudan 3 years ago. And my question is, I think I will agree with your prediction about on the graph, just because you have used some of the records that were used long time, and the probability that there is going to be fall is only 1, which is almost 0. And actually, this is very true. But the only thing that we can talk about in this election is whether the exception was actually the exception can happen and how it's going to happen. That's the thing I may ask about this, because in liberalism, McCain, we have seen is actually getting out from being conservative and going down to be either a bipartisan or even going to be a liberal. So is there a probability where we can have him winning the election, like the exception that you just mentioned? That's the question. Then the other question is, from my experience outside there and observation about how I read about the actual American politics, is like people are seeing that this kind of change is about whether somebody else can come who have never been to power in America. And to connect it to the foreign affairs, there is a problem you have just mentioned, that United States has been a kind of put down, like the people there headed the ally, and it's like you have observed that we are losing even the allies. So is the change of ethnicity, or what we call a race problem, when Obama may win as a racial president, is it going to help in anything about the allies? And the other thing is, I see the issue of Middle East and some of the problem there, like a kind of ethnicity problem, especially the problem of Iraq. It's not about either power, because in 1991, when Bush went to the war in Iraq, it was something like they were a kind of a Shia and Sunni and politics of Saudi Arabia and America. And when the President Bush continued about it, I think what was lacking is about the skill of dealing with the ethnicity between the Sunni and the Shia, because and the dangers you have identified, it maybe look the same as with what I'm thinking about. So I think if Shia is still in the power, then it will really be difficult for America to get something unless the Sunni got into the power. And that's how I look at it. So Do you see the same thing? That is my question.
Go first.
Okay. Well, there's quite an agenda of questions. I guess the first question, or one of the questions that I jotted down was, can McCain win after this meltdown? And I think there is some possibility of that. I wouldn't count him out completely. Just this is where the Gallup poll stood as of yesterday. I don't have today's reading. But I should note that the Gallup poll is, at this point, it shows McCain as in the weakest position of any major poll. So other polls would have his deficit a little smaller. Secondly, again, the historical record is the front runner, whoever the front runner is, would have his lead decline or shrink. The election gets closer as you move in these last 26 days. The odds are better that the poll numbers go up closer to 50-50 than further downward. Now, those are the odds historically. If the stock market keeps losing 600 points every day, all bets are off. But at this point, I'd say the chances of McCain winning are probably 1 in 5, maybe. I'd say there's at this point Obama appears to have a large enough lead. Second point was about having a black candidate in the race, a major party black. This is one of the big unknowns for this election from the beginning, among a number of things that make this election particularly hard to handicap. And that is, we don't know about the so-called Bradley effect, whether there are people who are saying they will vote for Obama that when they get in the privacy of the voting booth will not. We don't know precisely how much having an African-American candidate on the ticket will affect turnout rates, both among blacks and among whites. I mean, my guess is black turnout rate is going to soar. We don't know how much. And we don't know how much of a backlash there might be on the white side. So those are things we are in uncharted territory on those, as we are when it comes to the generational split in this election. This election is also very unusual in that Obama has been doing far better in the polls among respondents under 30 than he has among respondents over 40. So young people tend not to vote, and the same numbers are at the same rates as older Americans. So will that stay the same, or will that change? And we have a tough time predicting vote choice. We have an even tougher time predicting turnout and how people will actually vote. And if things weren't tough enough, now we have early voting in a lot of states. And will early voting be one mechanism to bring out more of the youth vote? We simply don't know at this point.
You asked a rich array of questions, which I can't exhaustively answer. I'm not even going to attempt to, so I'll reassure you on that score. But let me take the race question and then the issue of Sunni versus Shia. On the race question, in Barack Obama's, the fact that he's an African American, or as they would say, he doesn't look like the previous 43 occupants of the White House. I think it's pretty clear that that's part of his appeal outside of the United States. In some sense, just by virtue of biography, a President Obama is in many ways the fulfillment of the promise of the American dream. Or also, 40 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King, or 45 years after Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, when the man will be judged by the content of his character rather than the color of his skin. So that's in many ways quite impressive, and it preaches to the highest aspects of American ideals. And I think if you look at the polls, it's pretty clear that the American public, understands that Barack Obama's election as president would have a far greater impact on America's image around the world than Senator McCain's. The most recent poll by the New York Times had, I believe, 53% of Americans thinking that Obama's election would improve our image in the world, and only 23% thought that Senator McCain's election would be. But, and that's obviously an advantage if Obama becomes president that he can exploit or use to advance his agenda, but it's also a risk for him. It's a risk because there may be expectations that he's going to deliver a lot more than he will be able to deliver. At the end of the day, people get judged on what they do as opposed to what they might do. The second thing is that I think this is particularly true in Europe, but not only in Europe. They may be quite surprised after the election to discover that he's going to ask a lot more from them, and they may not want to pay the bill. This is most clearly the issue on Afghanistan, where, again, Senator Obama, since first throwing his hat in the ring, has talked about increasing American troop presence in Afghanistan. He's going to call on the allies to do more. But if you look in Europe among our NATO allies, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for doing a lot more, particularly since all the word coming out is that out of Afghanistan is that our presence there, by I mean Western/NATO presence, is not working and things are getting worse rather than better. You may have seen today's New York Times article leaking a draft national intelligence estimate. It's always hard to know whether the unfinished document actually says what the New York Times says it says, but certainly people I know who follow Afghanistan closely are worried that things are going in absolutely the wrong direction. Sorry, sir, I can't be Little Miss Mary Sunshine, but in this case the trend doesn't seem to be going in the right direction. So I think that sort of makes President Obama's presidency different, but at the end of the day, he's still going to be judged by his ability to deliver. And I do think whether it's he or Senator McCain, there's just an awful lot of difficult problems out there that don't lend themselves to easy solutions. On the issue of Sunnis versus Shia, I take your point. I would actually broaden the issue. Part of the problem the United States has is that our hope is that we can go and help societies become better. And I mean that's part of why so many Americans are wedded to this idea. It's almost in our DNA that America's role is to spread democracy. But the reality is it can be extraordinarily hard to do that because at the end of the day, how other societies function or whether they succeed or not depends on the choices that they themselves make. And we all know in our personal lives that it's very, very difficult to get others to do what we want them to do when we try to run their lives. Parents discover this all the time when they try to get their kids to make more sensible decisions. But if you don't want to use that analogy, there's this cable show on A&E about intervention of people with family members who are sort of in great trouble, trying to get them to walk the straight and narrow, and it's really difficult. And really part of the problem is whether you're talking about Iraq, you're talking about Afghanistan, you're talking about Haiti. And we can go down the list of places where the United States has been involved in the past in nation building, is that when you get involved, you become part of the problem. Okay? And when you're trying to help, you end up deciding some people are winners and some people are losers. And the natural human reaction is people don't like being designated the losers, and they find ways to become winners. And it becomes very, very messy. We've discovered this time and time again. And so the answer might be, well, we should stop doing it. And I think one of the reasons we don't do it is partly because we're convinced it's our mission as a country to do it, but partly we also understand in a globalizing world where problems no longer stay at home. They cross borders. And so we're afraid if we just sort of stand back, all that'll happen is more problems will come our way. So we're sorry if we do, and we'll regret it if we don't.
We have time for at least one more question here. Anybody?
Well, I can give you one really long answer.
Okay.
Can I ask Jim a question?
Yep.
It's the Nixon goes to China question. Certainly, Obama has been attacked as being sort of too soft in Iraq. Sort of cutting and, if not cutting and running, cutting and jogging out of Iraq, and he, in response to that, he seems to have taken a harder line position on Pakistan, suggesting we go in at some point. And in the debate the other night, he took a very hard line on Iran having nuclear weapons. Do you think that sort of the pressure of the campaign may have forced him into taking a harder line position, a more pro-military or aggressive position in foreign policy than he would have had otherwise?
It's a great question. I would push it back. I think any Democrat who wants to be president of the United States has to find some way to mark out that he or she is tough on foreign affairs. You know the polls as well as I do. When it comes to national security issues, the public is much less impressed with the potential for Democratic leadership. So Bill Clinton, for example, in 1992 ran about talking about the butchers of Beijing. Even though many of it, and he was going to be tough on Bosnia and a variety of other things, he wanted to show that he was tough. And whereas conversely, Republicans have a different set of issues, and that's why President Bush or Governor Bush back in 2000 talked about compassionate conservatism, so he could deal with sort of his perceived
A humble foreign policy.
other stuff. So I don't think he's any different. My guess is, I mean, really, the Pakistan issue I find fascinating because how shall I put this? He didn't say what his opponent said he said to begin with, and number two, what he said wasn't unreasonable, and in fact, it has become the policy of this administration, which is quite stunning. What he said is if we had actionable intelligence of al-Qaeda leadership and Pakistan was either unwilling or unable, he would do something about it. It's hard for me to imagine any American administration that wouldn't do that. It was seized on originally by Senator Clinton, largely because they were trying to find some way to damage Senator Obama. And the argument wasn't that it was a bad thing to do. It was, quote, naive to talk about this. Even though, again, as I think Senator Obama definitely pointed out in the last debate, we can find plenty of occasions where Senator McCain has talked about, that hasn't been sort of Rooseveltian or TR-ish in talking softly and carrying a big stick. So I don't think he's in push. I think, actually, though, Senator Obama or President Obama will have a problem, which is, let's assume he wins, as you suggested, and he's going to face Republicans.
80%.
Okay, but I just
I won't go all the way.
But we're
Okay.
doing a thought experiment.
Okay,
I mean, I think
okay.
he's going to have he can be whipsawed between Democrats who want him to not walk out of Iraq but rush out of Iraq
Right.
and focus on domestic issues, which will push his agenda in one direction, and Republicans trying to find some way to get back in the game. And I think what they're going to go, they'll do what you do. You look at all the polls, and this is where my opponent is most likely to be weakest, and that's the perception that Democrats are not strong on foreign policy. So we'll go after him. That is what Republicans did to Bill Clinton. And I worked in the Clinton White House at the time, and it was bare knuckle politics. Anything you did was used as an opportunity to try to score political points. And so foreign policy became domestic politics by other means. And that's what actually means that I think it's really sort of interesting the way this works. A President Obama has less leeway on a lot of these issues than a President McCain does, because everyone, it's again, if you look at the polls, it's pretty clear. The public says we're concerned about Barack, he may be too weak, but we're really concerned about McCain because he may be too belligerent. Okay, so someone like a President McCain in some of these crises could do nothing. Everyone says, good, he didn't make it worse. Okay, whereas if you were President Obama, the fear is he's weak, and so he has to do something to show that he's being tough and not being walked over. And I think that's going to be a very difficult line for the administration to walk, even an Obama administration, because some of these issues are dangerous. The Iranian issue, I think, particularly is difficult. Thinking about Hamas or Hezbollah, particularly Hezbollah. Russia, I worry less about at the end of the day, because, number one, anything the Russians are likely to do, we can't do anything about anyway. One of the remarkable things about Georgia, and this is why I think in this sense the election hasn't really been that edifying, is that the Russians went into Georgia, and everybody in the American political spectrum stumbled over themselves to sort of adopt sort of the Cold War motif of the big, awful Russians picking on little Georgians. Now, I don't want to make a brief for President Putin, but what I would suggest is that our rhetoric in criticizing the Russians far exceeded any realistic policy response we could make. And we were in high moral dudgeon. I believe Senator McCain's response was, well, what we'll do is we'll kick him out of the G8. which is just mismatched to the rhetoric. And indeed, what troubles me the most is that the Georgians were not without blame in all of this. And I think one of the risks we have, and this is always the case, is where you have what we call a moral hazard problem. When you go to countries like Georgia, and our rhetoric's very large about what we're going to do for Georgia, which encourages the Georgians to act irresponsibly, which is what I believe the Georgian government did. It essentially baited the Russians. The Russians were waiting for the provocation, and they delivered it. And these are the things out of which small crises can become really big crises. But it's very hard to get up in the American political spectrum and say, wait a second, the Georgians were baiting the bear, and perhaps that's not a wise idea, and we need to we need to demand responsibility from our allies. That's not something that Senator Obama could do, even if that's what many of his advisors felt, because politically it's sort of untenable.
Well, please join me in thanking our two guests tonight. And thank you very much for being here, and good evening.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.